In the heart of Constantinople, beneath the soaring marble columns and gilded mosaics, stood the Hippodrome, the roaring stage of an empire. Here, before 80,000 voices rising in unison, a spectacle unfolded each night that even Rome itself had outlawed. It was called Leda and the Swan, but what the name concealed was a ritual of cruelty so grotesque that even gladiatorial blood sports paled beside it. At the center of the arena lay a child, bare, vulnerable, no older than 10. Around her, the handlers released the geese. The birds had been trained to pluck barley seeds scattered across her skin, their beaks stabbing at her tiny body as the crowd erupted in laughter, in jeers, in cheers. Coins rained down from the stand, silver and bronze clattering against her flesh, as if her humiliation were a sacred duty performed for their amusement. To the thousands watching, this was entertainment, sanctioned by law. To the little girl, beneath the swan's wings, it was the beginning of a life carved from pain. That girl's name was Theodora. She had not been destined for this stage. Her father, Acacius, had been a man of some standing, the burkeeper of the Greens, one of Constantinople's two great factions. In a city where every citizen's future was bound to a color blue or green, his role was both brutal and prestigious. He trained the massive brown bears that battled in the Hippodrome, a keeper of spectacle for the roaring masses. As long as he lived, his family was under the protection of the Greens. But in the year 504, Acacius died suddenly. One man's death in a world of endless violence should have meant little. Yet for his widow and 3 young daughters, it was the end of everything. By custom, the position of burkeeper and the protection that came with it should have passed to his family. The law of the factions promised as much. But corruption moves quickly in Constantinople, and promises are easily sold. Asterius, the Greens' dancing master, pocketed a bribe and handed the title to another man. Just like that, daughters were stripped of their protection, abandoned by the very system that had sworn to shield them. Theodora's mother, once the wife of an official, now stood at the brink of starvation with her children. The choices were stark: watch them waste away, or surrender them to the entertainment industry that thrived on trafficking young bodies. She chose survival, though survival would demand a terrible price. And so, one day, she dressed her 3 daughters in laurel wreaths, the ancient symbol of supplication, and led them into the Hippodrome. Before the deafening roar of the crowd, she paraded them as if they were offerings to a temple altar, begging for mercy, advertising their availability to those who profited from the empire's most hidden economy. It was a ritual of humiliation, calculated and cruel. 3 little girls made to bow before 80,000 strangers. The Greens, who should have sheltered them, turned their backs without hesitation. No pity, no aid, just silence, cold and final. But the Blues, the rival faction, took notice. They gave her stepfather employment, a meager lifeline. Yet in that act, something deeper was etched into the young girl's memory. She would never forget who had betrayed her family and who had shown mercy. It was a lesson in allegiance that would shape the rest of her life. At 10 years old, Theodora entered the darkness of the Hippodrome, not as a spectator, but as its prey. Her childhood ended the moment she lay on the stage, naked, while geese pecked at her skin and men hurled coins onto her body. The same coins that clinked in the sand were the empire's seal of approval. Proof that this was not crime but culture, not shame but spectacle, and beyond the performance lay something worse. The law of Byzantium declared that actresses and performers were the same as prostitutes. To appear on that stage was to be marked for life. When the show ended, the back rooms opened, the shadowed chambers where children, some as young as 8, were expected to entertain senators, merchants, and the wealthy. There was no escape, no appeal. Their bodies were property of the empire's appetites. For most children, such a fate meant only ruin. For Theodora, it was the beginning of something else. Even as her body endured the abuse, her mind began to work. She watched, she listened. Night after night, she observed how men of immense stature, senators who debated laws, merchants who commanded fleets, grumbled into weakness in her presence. They paid for her suffering, but in their shame and desperation, they revealed something priceless, their vulnerability. The Hippodrome had destroyed countless children, but for Theodora it became a school and academy of pain and power. Where others broke, she studied. Where others wept, she learned. She discovered that men who appeared untouchable in daylight became pathetic in the dark, enslaved not by her, but by their own desires. This was not survival. This was education. The girl who should have been broken was, instead, learning the deepest lesson of her empire, that desire could be the sharpest weapon of all. And so the Hippodrome did not merely humiliate her. It armed her. It forged her into something the empire could not yet recognize, predator hidden in the body of a child. Theodora, born into betrayal, was beginning her transformation. The arena where she was made to suffer would, in time, become the arena where she would kill. To understand why Theodora's descent into the Hippodrome's shadows mattered, one must first understand the world that betrayed her. Constantinople was not merely a capital. It was a city divided into 2 armies without swords, 2 factions, that ruled everything from the baker's stall to the emperor's throne. They were called the Blues and the Greens. To outsiders, they appeared like sports teams, each with their own charioteers, colours, and chants echoing through the Hippodrome. But beneath the horse races and pageantry lay something darker. These factions were not games, they were governments within a government. They controlled who received work, who was punished for crimes, who climbed the ranks of politics, and who starved. Every citizen, rich or poor, belonged to one side. Allegiance was not choice, it was destiny. Acacius, Theodora's father, had belonged to the Greens. As their burkeeper, his role was essential, even revered in its own barbaric way. He trained the colossal brown bears that lumbered into the arena to fight for spectacle. The Greens fed upon these displays of raw violence, and as long as Acacius lived, his wife and daughters were sheltered beneath that shield. But when he died suddenly, their safety vanished with him. The rule of the factions was clear. The position and its protections should pass to his family. Yet rules mattered little when weighed against silver. Asterius, the Greens' dancing master, the man who distributed roles and wages in the entertainment hierarchy, accepted a bribe. With a stroke of corruption, he passed the burkeeper's title to another man. Theodora's family, once guarded, was cast out. No income, no safety, no ties of loyalty. Her mother, once a wife of status, was left a beggar with 3 girls clinging to her skirts. And in Constantinople, there was no mercy for widows. It was then that Theodora's mother made her fateful choice. She dressed her daughters in laurel wreaths, the ancient emblem of supplication, and marched them into the Hippodrome not as spectators, but as offerings. Before 80,000 roaring throats, she paraded her children as if placing them upon the altar of the city itself. The message was unmistakable. Take them, use them, but let them live. The crowd watched as 3 little girls bowed their heads. In humiliation, it was theater of desperation, a ritual of exposure. Every coin tossed, every approving nod from the stands, was not pity but purchase. The family had been transformed into commodities by a mother's last gamble to keep them alive. The Greens, whose corruption had caused this fall, turned their faces away. Not a hand lifted, not a crumb of compassion offered. Their silence was a death sentence as final as any execution. But across the political divide, the Blues were watching. To the Blues, this was more than spectacle. It was an opportunity to humiliate their rivals, to brand themselves as saviors where the Greens had failed. They took pity or, perhaps calculated, advantage and offered work to the girl's stepfather. It was meager employment, a lifeline thin as thread, but it was enough to tether the family to survival. For Theodora, the moment branded itself upon her memory. She was 10 years old, too young to grasp the full weight of politics, yet old enough to feel the sting of betrayal. She would never forgive the Greens for abandoning her family to starvation, nor would she forget that the Blues had thrown her a rope when she was drowning. That night marked the beginning of a division not of politics but of vengeance to the Greens. She owed a debt of hatred that would not fade with time. To the Blues, she owed gratitude that would grow into alliance. These allegiances, born not of ideology but of survival, would later shape the destiny of an empire. And yet, in that moment, Theodora was still only a child whose world had been dismantled by bribery and factional cruelty, a child whose body was no longer hers to keep. The factions had decided her fate, and in their betrayal they had sown the seeds of their own destruction. The Hippodrome was a monster that devoured children. It did not need swords or chains to enslave them. Its chains were the roar of the crowd. Its swords were the laws of Byzantium itself. And at just 10 years old, Theodora was one of its captives. Her specialty became the most infamous of spectacles. Leda and the Swan, naked, stretched upon the stage, she lay as trained geese plucked barley from her skin. The audience, thousands of men crowded shoulder to shoulder, roared with delight as feathers brushed against her small body and coins rained down upon her. Each coin that clinked against her flesh was not merely payment but permission. Permission for humiliation, permission for degradation. When the performance ended, the true horror began. The back rooms of the Hippodrome opened, filled with men of rank, senators in embroidered cloaks, merchants with purses heavy with gold, soldiers fresh from campaign. They came not to watch, but to consume, and the law itself stood behind them. In Byzantium, there was no distinction between actress and prostitute. To appear on stage was to be condemned forever as a commodity of flesh. To be a performer was to belong to the appetites of men. Most children broke beneath this system. Some faded into despair, some died young, and many became hollow shells, their eyes vacant long before their bodies gave out. But Theodora did not break, she learned. While others wept, she observed. Each night, as she endured what the empire demanded, she watched her tormentors. Senators who spoke in the Senate with booming voices now stammered and whimpered in the dark. Merchants who commanded fleets became pitiful beggars for a moment's attention. Soldiers who had faced blades on battlefields trembled in the face of rejection from a child they thought they owned. Theodora saw the truth hidden beneath their power, that desire unmakes men. The Hippodrome became her university, and its curriculum was humiliation not hers, but theirs. Every performance was a lecture, Every encounter in the back rooms was a lesson. She discovered that lust was not pleasure, was weakness. That the higher a man's rank, the deeper his desperation. That the empire itself, ruled by men who believed themselves untouchable, was vulnerable not to armies, but to its own appetites. It was here, among the fetid stench of the Hippodrome's chambers, that Theodora's mind sharpened into a weapon. She studied weakness the way a physician studies wounds. She catalogued the stutters, the blushes, the shameful requests whispered in the dark. She saw how pain could be turned into profit, how humiliation could be bartered for coin, and how men would trade their dignity for a single night of indulgence. She was still a child, but already she was becoming something else, a predator dressed as prey. 6 years passed in this grim apprenticeship. By 16, Theodora was no longer just another performer. She was the Hippodrome's most requested figure, desired not merely for her body, but for something her clients could not name: her intelligence, her control, the way she could make them feel powerful while quietly stripping them of it. The same senators who once tossed coins onto her naked childhood form now paid fortunes to have her privately. And while they believed they were purchasing her submission, the truth was the opposite. Each transaction deepened her understanding of their corruption, their weaknesses, their fears. They thought they were buying a prostitute. They were, in fact, creating their own executioner. Theodora was not surviving, she was mastering. She was not simply enduring, she was preparing. Every moment in that chamber of shadows brought her closer to a singular truth: that the appetites which enslaved her would one day be the very chains she used to enslave others. The Hippodrome had meant to break her. Instead, it had built her. It had taken a child and forged her into something far more dangerous than any general or senator could imagine. Theodora was graduating from her University of Pain, and soon she would begin to apply what she had learned. By the time Theodora reached 16, she was no longer just another face in the Hippodrome's endless parade of suffering. She was its star, infamous, whispered about in private corridors, requested by senators and merchants who paid fortunes for her presence. But even for her, survival inside Constantinople's cruel machine could not last forever. The moment came when Fortunor would appear to be Fortunoct. His name was Hecebolus, governor of the distant province of Libya. He was a man of immense wealth and authority, one who ruled over soldiers, cities, and vast tracts of land in Rome's African dominions. When he saw Theodora perform, he did not see a child scarred by exploitation. He saw something he wanted to possess, not for an evening, not for a week, but permanently. The offer was unprecedented. Hecebolus would take Theodora from the Hippodrome and install her in his palace as his personal concubine. No more backroom degradation, no more nightly spectacles. She would live surrounded by luxury, marble halls, perfumed baths, silken gowns, and servants to wait upon her every whim. For a girl who had spent 6 years being passed from man to man, the proposition must have seemed like deliverance. And so, at 16, Theodora left Constantinople behind. She crossed the Mediterranean, into the desert lands of Libya, where the sun burned white against the stone walls of Hecebolus's palace. At last, she was free from the jeers of the Hippodrome. But what she found was not freedom, it was a new kind of captivity. For nearly 4 years, she lived in the governor's household, his favored possession, clothed in fine fabrics, but bound more tightly than ever before. Hecebolus believed he had purchased her body, her loyalty, her soul, and outwardly Theodora played the role. She smiled, she obeyed, she adorned herself in jewels. but inwardly she continued her education. If the Hippodrome had been her school of pain, Libya became her academy of power. Every night she studied Hesebolas, the way she once studied senators and merchants. She discovered that even a man who commanded armies could be reduced to desperation when desire ruled him. She learned which indulgences shamed him, which obsessions consumed him, which secret pleasures left him weak and pliable. And more importantly, she discovered something new: how to bend those weaknesses toward politics. She began, slowly, carefully, to nudge his decisions. A word here, a suggestion there. Policies shifted, appointments changed, as the governors were bent subtly toward the whispers of his concubine. Theodora was no longer merely manipulating men for coin, she was shaping the affairs of a province. But she overstepped. Hesebolas, for all his indulgence, was not blind. When he realized that his concubine was influencing his governance, his pride ignited into rage. The mask of civility fell away, revealing the brutal truth of her position. She was not an equal, not a partner, not even a mistress. She was property. The moment of betrayal was swift and merciless. One day he cast her out. No silks, no jewels, no servants. He hurled her belongings into the burning sand and spat curses as he sent her away. "Worthless whore," he screamed, stripping her of the illusion of power. Theodora stood under the blistering sun, the desert wind filling her lungs with dust. For years of luxury had evaporated in an instant, leaving her with nothing but the bitter taste of humiliation. But what Hesebolas had intended as punishment became her final, most valuable lesson. For in that humiliation, Theodora understood something she had only half grasped before, that intimacy was not survival. Not indulgence, it was war. When she turned her back on Libya, she was no longer the same girl who had left Constantinople. She carried with her scars, knowledge, and a weapon sharpened to its deadliest edge. Hesebolas believed he had destroyed her. In truth, he had completed her training. Theodora's journey back to Constantinople would be a crucible of survival. Ship by ship, port by port, she would sell herself to live, but now with purpose. No longer prey, she was becoming the predator, armed with the certainty that men's desires could not only be exploited, but turned against them entirely. The Hippodrome had given her pain, Libya had given her strategy, and soon the empire itself would feel the force of what these lessons had created. Theodora left Libya, stripped of everything: her silks, her jewels, her false safety. What remained was her body, her mind, and the lessons seared into her by years of humiliation. Across the burning sand and onto the waiting ships, she carried only herself. But now that was enough. The Mediterranean became her battleground. To the sailors, the merchants, the smugglers who crossed its waters, she was just another desperate woman selling her flesh for passage or coin. But Theodora was no longer desperate. Every night below deck, in the reeking dark, she tested her theories. She bartered not just with her body, but with her intelligence, with her ability to listen, to flatter, to extract secrets. The cramped holds of merchant ships stank of sweat and seawater. Rats scurried along the planks, and men, drunk on cheap wine, poured at her as if she were property. But while they thought they were buying her, it was she who was buying them, piece by piece, weakness by weakness. A Roman merchant wanted her not only for her body, but for conversation, for a mind sharper than he expected. Between whispers and embraces, he let slip trade secrets, the names of competitors, routes of caravans, smuggling deals, disguised as legitimate shipments. Theodora stored it all, a living archive of vulnerabilities. A ship captain, eager to boast, promised her free passage in exchange for pleasure. She gave it, but while he lay breathless, she teased out knowledge of his illegal cargo, of bribes paid to customs officials, of dangerous debts owed to creditors. Each man thought himself a conqueror. Each left her with a weapon she would one day use. Every encounter was not survival, it was study. She was building a mental map of how power moved across the empire, and how easily desire could corrupt even the most disciplined men. Her journey carried her to Alexandria, the beating heart of learning and religion. Here, Theodora made her most calculated move yet. She converted to Monophysite Christianity, a faith persecuted by the empire's orthodox establishment. To many, such a choice might have seemed a moment of spiritual revelation. For Theodora, it was strategy. The Monophysites were more than a sect. They were a political force, an underground network bound together by persecution. By joining them, Theodora gained something she had never possessed before, a community beyond the stage, beyond the brothel, beyond the bedchamber. She was no longer just a trafficked girl. She was a believer, a member of a movement that spanned provinces and reached into the highest circles of power in Antioch. She met Macedonia, a fellow performer and spy who carried information back to Constantinople. Macedonia had been watching her, waiting, and now she whispered news that startled Theodora to her core. A man in Constantinople, a prince named Justinian, nephew of the reigning emperor, was asking about her. He had heard stories of the circus girl who had risen from degradation, who had survived a governor's palace and returned sharper than before, who knew the hidden psychology of men better than they knew themselves. Theodora had spent years believing. She was forgotten by her city, erased by its cruelty, yet her reputation had preceded her, carried across provinces and seas. The empire had cast her out, but whispers of her name had already reached the ears of the man who would soon inherit it. And so, as her ship approached Constantinople's golden harbour, Theodora gazed at the skyline she had once fled, the domes of Hagia Sophia, the spires of the palaces, the looming shadow of the hippodrome where her childhood had been stolen. She returned, not as the girl who had been humiliated before 80,000 voices, but as a woman armed with everything pain had taught her. The city had once devoured her. Now she intended to devour it. Constantinople, 522 CE, the empire's jewel glittered with marble and gold, but beneath its grandeur, intrigue pulsed like blood through veins. It was here, in a city that had once paraded her naked for coins, that Theodora returned, and it was here that she would seize her greatest prize. Prince Justinian was 40 years old when he first saw her, nephew of the reigning emperor Justin I, heir to the purple. He was already a man consumed by ambition. He had risen from obscurity, an unremarkable peasant from the Balkans inn, to the highest corridors of power. His sharp mind had carried him upward, but in matters of the heart, he was untested. He believed he had seen everything. He had no idea what awaited him. When he looked at Theodora across a court gathering, he saw beauty first. She was luminous, her presence magnetic, her eyes carrying a depth that silenced the chatter of the chamber. But what he did not see was the strategy behind the smile, the calculation in every glance. She had spent 16 years learning how to dismantle men. Now, she set her sights on the most powerful man in the empire. The seduction began not with touch, but with words. She understood what Justinian craved. Not just beauty, he was surrounded by beautiful women every day, but intelligence. Conversation, companionship that sharpened his thoughts. She gave him all of it, weaving wit and wisdom into every encounter. She let him believe that he discovered in her not a courtesan, but an equal. Every private moment was a trap disguised as intimacy. She had learned this long ago, first in the Hippodrome, then in Libya. She studied his preferences, his needs, his vulnerabilities with the same cold precision she once applied to drunken merchants. She discovered quickly that Justinian longed, not only for flesh, but for connection, and so she offered it while slowly binding him tighter with each passing night. The empire gossiped, scandalized. Senators whispered in disgust. The heir to Rome's throne wanted to wed a prostitute, a woman who had performed degrading spectacles for the mob. You would marry a whore, they sneered. To them, it was unthinkable. For centuries, Byzantine law had declared actresses permanently tainted. Once on stage, forever a prostitute. No senator could marry such a woman, much less an emperor. The barrier was absolute. But the greatest opposition came not from the Senate, it came from a woman. Empress Euphemia, wife of Justin I, stood in Theodora's path like an immovable wall. She knew Theodora's kind because she had once been lowborn herself, rising from slavery into the purple. Yet Euphemia saw something far darker in the younger woman. I was a slave, she declared in front of the court, her voice sharp, her finger pointing toward Theodora. But I was never a prostitute. The chamber froze. It was more than insult, it was an accusation, a warning. Euphemia understood exactly what Theodora represented, not simply a former courtesan, but a master of manipulation. She saw that if this woman were allowed into the palace, she would not merely share Justinian's bed, she would control his throne. For months, Euphemia blocked every attempt at marriage. She forbade Theodora from entering court, stalled reforms, whispered poison into the emperor's ear. She fought with the desperation of someone who knew she was guarding not only the dignity of the empire, but its very stability. And then, suddenly, in 523 CE, Euphemia was dead. No illness had plagued her, no warning had been given. She retired to her chambers one evening and never rose again. The cause was recorded as natural, but rumors spread quickly. For Theodora had learned much in her years among prostitutes and performers, how to use herbs to quiet violent clients, how to dose toxins that left no trace, how to disguise murder as fate. Whether Euphemia's death was chance or design, no one could prove, but the timing was too precise, too perfect. Within weeks, Justinian pressed his uncle to rewrite the law itself. In 525 CE, a decree was issued. Actresses could, under special imperial dispensation, marry into the senatorial class. A law tailored so narrowly that it might as well have borne one named Theodora. That same year, in the Hagia Sophia, beneath soaring domes and mosaics that glittered like the heavens, Theodora walked down the marble aisle. Gone was the little girl paraded naked before jeering crowds. Gone was the concubine cast into the desert sands. She was veiled in imperial purple, her every step echoing with triumph. The wedding was more than a union. It was a coronation of survival, a victory march for a woman who had clawed her way from the lowest depths of humiliation to the very heart of power. But this was no ordinary marriage. This was the fusion of obsession and ambition, of intelligence and manipulation. Justinian believed he was marrying for love. In truth, he was marrying the most dangerous weapon Byzantium had ever produced. The empire had created her in cruelty. Now she would use that cruelty to rule it. 7 years after Theodora's marriage, the empire burned. It was January of 530 to CE, the dead of winter, when Constantinople erupted in the greatest revolt the Byzantine world had ever seen. The blues and the greens, those eternal rivals who had once determined Theodora's childhood fate, suddenly found common cause. Their rage was not simply about taxes or corruption or the endless intrigues of court. Their fury had a name, and that name was Theodora. They spat it into the streets, cursing her as a whore who had dared to sit upon the throne. To them, she was not an empress but an insult, a living symbol of the empire's corruption. Proof that intimacy and spectacle had replaced nobility and law. Nika, they roared, the word thundering through the city, conquer, but beneath that cry lay another unspoken. The prostitute must die. For 5 days, the city became a battlefield. The narrow streets filled with smoke as torches ignited homes and markets. The smell of burning timber and flesh mingled in the air. The Senate, house, repository of centuries of law, was reduced to ash. The original Hagia Sophia pride of Constantinople's faith collapsed in fire and ruin. Blood ran down gutters as rebels butchered imperial guards in alleys and squares. Even Justinian's closest soldiers faltered. Loyalty wavered. Officers whispered of retreat. The emperor's advisors, pale with terror, urged flight. Load the treasury, abandon the city, save your life, they begged. For them, survival meant escape. But Justinian was not the one they needed to convince. The true decision-maker was the woman seated beside him. Theodora rose. Her silk robes rustled softly against the marble floor, but her voice cut through the chamber like iron. She had been silent until now, letting the men whimper their counsel of retreat. But when she spoke, her words froze them. "My opinion is this," she said, her tone unshaken, her eyes fixed on Justinian. "The present time, above all others, is not the moment for flight, even if it brings safety. Royalty is a good burial. Shroud," the words landed like thunder. In them was no fear, no hesitation, only the steely conviction of a woman who had endured every humiliation the Hippodrome could offer. She had once stood naked before 80,000 men. Now she stood clothed in purple, defying 80,000 rebels. The mob's fury did not terrify her, it was familiar. It was the same fury she had faced as a child, the same chorus of jeers and demands. She knew its rhythm, its hunger, and she knew how to kill it. Justinian, bound to her by obsession as much as love, listened. The Empress had spoken, and he obeyed. Retreat was abandoned. Blood would answer blood. The plan was simple, brutal, and brilliant. Generals, and Mundus would lure the rebels into the Hippodrome with the promise of triumph. There, as they cheered their chosen usurper, the exits would be sealed. Soldiers would flood the stands. Swords would finish what fire had begun. And so, on the 7th day, the Hippodrome once again became a theatre, not for games, not for geese pecking barley, but for slaughter. 100,000 packed the arena, their chants shaking the stone walls. They believed they were witnessing victory, the fall of Justinian, the rise of a new emperor. But what they had entered was a trap, and the arena that had once devoured Theodora's childhood would now devour them. The iron gates clanged shut. The crowd's cheers turned to screams. From every corridor, imperial soldiers advanced, their blades drawn, their armor glinting red in torchlight. The massacre was merciless. Families were cut down where they stood. Men trampled one another in desperate flight, only to find every exit barred. Women clutched children as spears tore through them. Blood pooled in the sand, thick and dark, soaking into the very ground where Theodora had once lain as a child performer. The noise was deafening, scraping steel, the tearing of flesh. But to Theodora, it was not chaos, it was performance. The same performance she had given the crowd as a child, only now the roles were reversed. They were no longer spectators, they were the spectacle. By the day's end, the hippodrome fell. Silent, 30,000 corpses carpeted the arena floor. No revolt remained, no opposition survived. The irony was perfect, cruel, and absolute. The arena that had humiliated her was now her stage of triumph. The same sands that once bore the tears of a trafficked girl were now drenched in the blood of her enemies. When the smoke cleared, Justinian was emperor undisputed. But it was Theodora who had secured the throne not through armies, but through the will to kill. From that day forward, no one in Constantinople doubted the Empress again. She was no longer the child of the hippodrome, no longer the concubine, cast into the desert. She was a ruler made of blood, crowned in vengeance, and draped in the shroud of 30,000 dead. Theodora had taken her place, not beside Justinian, but above Jimin, fear, in power, in legend. The massacre of the hippodrome secured Theodora's throne, but bloodshed alone could not maintain power. In a court teeming with rivals, generals, bishops, and senators, all plotting their own ascents, steel was not enough. Survival required something subtler, something she had perfected since childhood, manipulation, while Justinian sat upon the throne in his gilded palace. Theodora worked elsewhere in chambers cloaked with incense and whispers. She built what historians later called a parallel government, though it was something darker, an empire of secrets. Her agents were not generals or senators, but those the court overlooked, eunuchs, servants, dancers, and women who moved unseen through corridors and bedrooms. They carried no swords, but they carried something sharper, knowledge, who slipped into whose bed at night, which senator's lusts could be turned into shame, which bishop whispered doubts about Justinian's piety. Every confession murmured in intimacy, every secret revealed in weakness, found its way back to her, and she weaponized them all. In public, she forced senators to prostrate themselves, to kiss both her feet and Justinian's. It was not reverence, it was humiliation. She inverted the same dynamic forced upon her as a child. Once she had been made to bow before crowds. Now the empire's most powerful men knelt before her. The performance was the same, but the power was hers, with this arsenal of secrets. Theodora began her campaign of elimination. The first target was Pope Silverius, 537 CE. When he refused to support her religious ally in Rome, Theodora did not argue theology. She turned to her oldest lesson, fear. Through Belisarius and his formidable wife Antonina herself, a master manipulator, Theodora manufactured charges of treason, whispering that the Pope conspired with the empire's enemies. Silverius was exiled to a desolate island, left to wither away in obscurity. His downfall was not the work of swords or armies, but of whispers crafted by a woman who had once survived them. But her true genius revealed itself with Queen Amalasuntha of the Ostrogoths. Amalasuntha was everything Theodora despised, noble by birth, elegant, commanding respect not through survival but inheritance. Worse, She corresponded with Justinian letters heavy with political alliance, perhaps tinged with something more. Theodora recognized the signs immediately. She had written those same kinds of letters once, had used the same veiled words of flattery and alliance to entangle men. She knew the danger because she had invented it. The solution was simple. If she could not control her, she would destroy her. Through Byzantine envoys, she encouraged Amalasuntha's own cousin to betray her. The queen was murdered, not in battle, not in ceremony, but in her bath naked, vulnerable, her body collapsing into crimson water. An intimate death, designed to mock intimacy itself. But Theodora's masterpiece came in 541 CE, with John the Cappadocian, Justinian's powerful Praetorian prefect. John was unlike other men, corrupt, yes, but cunning, immune to the usual manipulations. He saw Theodora for what she was, a predator cloaked in purple. He could not be seduced, nor easily broken, so she chose another weaponterer. For 6 months, John lived inside a waking nightmare. Each day, he received gifts delivered by anonymous hands, wilted flowers that reeked of death, tiny daggers hidden in boxes, paintings of executions that mirrored the cruelties of the hippodrome. His sleep fractured, his confidence eroded. He became paranoid, sweating, jumping at shadows. Theodora had recreated her own childhood torment inside his mind, breaking him piece by piece. When at last he stumbled, weakened by fear, she was ready. With Antonina's help, she ensnared him in a fabricated conspiracy, using his own daughter as bait. Every word he spoke in desperation was recorded, twisted, turned against him. Within weeks, John fell from imperial power to wandering the streets of Egypt in disgrace. The lesson was clear. Armies could be resisted, but the mind could not. Theodora did not need swords when she had trauma to wield dot from the ashes of her own suffering. She had created a system of rule unlike anything the empire had seen, one where secrets mattered more than armies, where humiliation mattered more than titles, where desire and fear could topple even the mightiest. The child of the hippodrome had become something far greater than an empress. She was a shadow across the empire, a spider weaving webs of secrets, every thread leading back to her. Those who underestimated her did not live long enough to make the mistake twice. Theodora had secured her throne in blood. She had destroyed her rivals through whispers and shadows. But her greatest legacy would not be massacres or assassinations. It would be law. From the moment she entered the palace, Theodora understood that her life had been shaped by rules written by men. Laws had branded her a prostitute at 10 years old, condemned her to degradation, stripped her of dignity before she had even known what the word meant. To survive, she had bent those laws. To rule, she would rewrite them. Justinian's reign is remembered for the Corpus Juris Civilis, the codification of Roman law that became the foundation of Western legal tradition. But behind its marble facade lay her fingerprints. While Justinian debated theology with bishops and dreamt of reconquering lost provinces, Theodora carved her vengeance into statutes. Her reforms struck first at the world that had destroyed her childhood, prostitution. She outlawed the coercion of women into brothels, made it illegal for pimps to prevent women from leaving, and ordered the closure of houses that trafficked in flesh. The girl once paraded naked before 80,000 spectators now wielded the pen to dismantle the system that had owned her. Yet her revenge was never simple. Where compassion seemed to reign, control often lurked beneath. She established the Metanoia convent, a house where former prostitutes were sent not to freedom, but to forced religious life. To some, it was salvation. To others, it was simply another prison. Theodora's reforms protected women from exploitation by binding them more tightly to her authority. Marriage, too, she reshaped. Women who once had little recourse against abusive husbands now gained the right to divorce them. For the first time, a wife could claim dignity and independence without fear of ruin. In cases of rape, her vengeance was merciless. The penalty was death, regardless of the man's social rank. His property would not pass to his heirs, but to the victim. These were not merely laws, they were weapons aimed at the very crimes she had endured. She rewrote family itself into a tool of control. No union in the imperial court escaped her oversight. She arranged marriages, severed engagements, dictated alliances with the cold calculation of a general placing pieces on a battlefield. To disobey her was to risk ruin. In this, she extended her own conquest of Justinian into dynastic permanence. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of her legal work was its dual nature. To the people, she was a savior, a protector of women, a champion of justice. To her enemies, she was a jailer, wielding law as both shield and dagger. For every woman rescued from the hippodrome's fate, another was locked behind convent walls. For every rapist punished, a rival's family was broken through orchestrated marriage. Compassion and cruelty intertwined until one was indistinguishable from the other. Her reforms did not erase her trauma, they enshrined it. The law became her revenge, codifying into permanence the lessons she had learned as a child, that power must be taken, that weakness must be punished, that survival is worth any cost. And yet, even as she carved her vengeance into the bones of the empire, her body was failing. Beneath the jewels and silks, the Empress was dying. At 48, disease-likely cancer began to consume her. She had built a kingdom of blood, secrets, and laws. But soon, she would face the one adversary she could not manipulate, seduce, or terrify. June 28, 548 CE. Theodora, Empress of Byzantium, was only 48 years old when death finally reached her. For decades, she had outwitted senators, toppled bishops, broken generals, and slaughtered crowds. She had stared down armies without flinching, poisoned obstacles without remorse, and reshaped laws to avenge her childhood torment. But now, her body betrayed her. The disease-likely breast cancer spread relentlessly, beyond the reach of physicians, beyond the reach of poisons, beyond the reach of fear. She faced it as she had faced everything else, unbending. Yet for the first time, no manipulation could save her. No seduction could turn the tide. She could conquer men, but not mortality. When she died in her chambers at the imperial palace, the empire trembled, not from the loss of an empress alone, but from the collapse of the force that had bound its ruler together. Justinian had been obsessed with her, so much so that her words had carried more weight than his generals, more sway than his senators, more force than his armies. Without her, he was hollow. The emperor who had rebuilt cities, who had dreamed of restoring Rome, suddenly seemed broken. He never remarried. For 17 more years he ruled, but weakly, haunted by her absence. It was as if Theodora had carried not only her own crown, but his as well, and when hers fell, so did his strength. The empire itself bore the scars of her dominance. After her death, few significant laws emerged. The vigor of reform, the ruthless intelligence behind the legal codes, had not belonged to Justinian alone. It had been hers. The Corpus Juris Civilis, the foundation of Western law, carried the fingerprints of a woman forged in exploitation. a woman who had learned to transform pain into power. Even in death, Theodora claimed victory over memory. In Ravenna, on the walls of San Vitale, her image was immortalized in mosaics. She is depicted larger than those around her, robed in imperial purple, bearing a chalice as if she were a priestess of divine authority. The cloth embroidered on her cloak shows the Magister three kings bringing gifts to Christ. That she too was of equal stature to royalty and divinity alike. The child who had once been jeered at by 80,000 men now stood forever as their sovereign. Larger than life, larger than legend, tourists today wander the hippodromes, ruins, taking photographs where the sand once drank the blood of 30,000 rebels. Few realized that this was also the stage where Theodora had been humiliated as a child, that the same arena which mocked her would later become her instrument of vengeance, that the greatest massacre of Byzantine history was orchestrated by the girl it had once broken. Her story is not simple triumph, nor is it simple tragedy. It is something darker. Theodora's life was proof that cruelty does not only destroy, it creates, that systems of exploitation meant to crush can forge predators, sharper than their masters. Was it worth it? Was the death of 30,000 in the hippodrome the price of one woman's rise? Was Justinian's empire stronger for her dominance saw merely enslaved to her trauma? History offers no answer. It only offers her shadow cast across centuries. The prostitute who became empress, the victim who became predator, the child who became legend. Theodora's final victory was not merely her survival, it was her transformation, from pawn to queen, from spectacle to sovereign, from victim to destroyer. And in that transformation lies the most unsettling truth of all. The world she left behind still bears her imprint. For in every law that defends the powerless, in every suspicion of power corrupted by desire, in every survivor who refuses to break, Theodora's voice whispers from the grave. The child of the hippodrome never died. She became eternal.